Okay, everybody. Today we'll talk about.
Can we finish?
Yeah, we did chemical. Last few slides of those are like surface tension due to hydrogen bonds. We talked about that.
Yeah, we finished off by the major ones, the body and brain.
So we'll talk about the cellular level. You remember there are different levels of organization. Chemical is the smallest, right? Then one step higher is the cellular level that deals with the cells and the organelles. So today we'll talk about the parts of a typical cell and the functions of important parts of a cell. First we'll see what is a cell, and then we'll see the parts of a typical cell. Then we'll talk about the cell membrane, which is the boundary of the cell. We'll see the structure of the cell membrane and functions. Then we'll talk about cell junctions. In your tissue, the cells are attached to each other, okay? And they are held together by the junctions. Those are called intercellular junctions or joinings. We'll talk about important junctions, okay? Then we'll talk about transport across the cell membrane. Cell membrane is a semi-permeable membrane. That means it is selectively permeable. It will allow certain chemicals pass through it. Make sense? Not everything. That's why we say selectively permeable or semi-permeable. So we'll see how the chemicals pass through the cell membrane or cross the cell membrane. That is the transport across the cell membrane. Then we'll see the response of a living cell in three types of solutions. If you put a living cell in hypotonic, hypertonic, or isotonic solutions, how the cell will respond. We'll see that. Then, so those are the main things we'll go over today. Okay. First, what is a cell? Cell is the smallest structural and functional unit of living organism or living body. Smallest structural and functional unit. Human body has 50 to 100 trillion cells, not million, not billion, trillion cells. Now, why we say that cell is the structural and functional unit? It is the smallest part of the body, okay, that can survive individually. A single cell can survive. Do you know that? Can you give me an example that a single cell can function and survive? What do you think? If you just copy the slides, then why I post the slides? No point of sitting here and copying the slides. You have the slides there already. Okay. Next time, you're supposed to bring the printout of the PowerPoints, okay? Because the lecture is to listen, not to copy from the PowerPoints, okay? So why we say cell is the smallest structural and functional unit? Because it is the smallest part of the body that can function individually. Example, you know, amoeba, bacteria, those are single cell microorganism, right? They can function and survive individually. Sperm, ovum, right? You can, keep it alive separately, individually, okay? In our research, we take the cell of the body and put in petri dish, right? And keep them alive by providing oxygen and nutrition. Make sense? So a single cell can stay or survive individually and function So that's the smallest unit. Now, in human body, there are more than 200 different types of cells. Example, red blood cells, right? White blood cells. You have neuron, the brain cells, right? Or neural tissue cells, muscle cells. So there are how many? More than 200 different types of cells. How they are different? They are different in size, shape, subcellular components, and functions. For example, red blood cells carry oxygen. White blood cells provide immunity, okay? Neurons transmit electrical signals. So the sex cells like sperm, ovum, they do what? Help in fertilization, right? Offspring. So you see that the cells are different. But one thing is common, all living cells are formed by these four components. C, H, O, and N. Carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen. Okay? Those are the four main components of the body. We talked about that in last class. Here, few examples. How the cells are different in, say, in size, shape, or functions. Top left, you see those two cells are fibroblasts. They produce fibers, connective tissue cells. That's why they are called fibroblasts. In the top right, you see those two red colored round cells are red blood cells or RBC. Yeah, they are round, flat, they transport oxygen, right? So function is different. They look different. Then you have the epithelial cells. 5 epithelial cells, you see they are attached to each other, right? And they form covering or surface of the body surface, okay, found in the body surface. Muscle cells, you see this is a skeletal muscle cell, long, right? Many nuclei inside. And these are smooth muscle cells. You see even different muscle cells are different, right? Skeletal muscle cells are long, have multiple nuclei. Smooth muscle cells are small and they have a single nucleus inside, okay? Contraction is the function. Then, if you go down, you see this is a fat cell. Fat cell. Fat cell stores energy. Plenty of energy is stored inside the fat cell. And another thing you see here, the nucleus is not in the center but attached to the membrane. Then you see a cell that has multiple processes like this. Multiple processes. And this cell is called a macrophage. Let me write it down. And you know, this cell provides immunity. It can engulf. Phagocytosis is the function. Okay? Then, in the right side, you see this is a neuron, a nerve cell. Same thing, nerve cell or a neuron. Neuron can produce and transmit electrical signal. So just write down what I am saying, okay? Don't copy the PowerPoint. So, nerve cell is also called what? Neuron. And the function is production and transmission of what kind of signal? Electrical. Write it down. Electrical signal transmission is the function. That's how I will ask the questions. Then, this is a sperm. Sperm and ovum are sex cells. Male sex cells are sperm, female sex cells are ovum, okay, or egg. You see, it looks different than all other cells, right? It's like a tiny baby fish, has a head, body, and tail, right? And it can move by moving the tail part. And fertilizing the egg is its function, okay? So giving new life. Reproduction. So these are few examples of those 200 different types of cells. Now, the parts of a typical cell. A typical cell, why we say typical? Because most of the cells are like this. A typical cell has a cell membrane, which is also called plasma membrane, right? Cell membrane or plasma membrane that gives the boundary of the cell. It also gives the shape of the cell. And number 3, it separates inside the cell from outside. Make sense? This is simple. Gives what? Outer boundary, and gives the shape of the cell. Make sense? And separates inside from outside. So those are 3 functions of the cell membrane or plasma membrane. In the center, you have a nucleus, which contains chromosomes, and chromosomes contain DNA. Okay. Now, in one word, nucleus is called the control center of the cell. Okay? Control center of the cell. And nucleus contains DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. DNA is the structure inside the nucleus that encodes genetic information. Okay? Genetic information. That means hereditary information is transmitted from the parents to the offspring. Okay? In between the plasma membrane and the nucleus, you have the cytoplasm. Now, in the cytoplasm, you have 2 types of organelles. Cytoplasm contains organelles. Okay? Now, organelles could be 2 types: membranous and non-membranous. Okay? Simple. Membranous organelles have covering, right? Membrane, and non-membranous don't have membrane or covering. Okay. Now, if you see the nucleus has 3 parts. Okay, nucleus has 3 parts. I'm writing down here. Outer covering is nuclear envelope. Makes sense? Outer covering. And inside the nucleus, you have a dense structure that is called nucleolus. Nucleolus. Okay? It gives about 25% volume of the nucleus. Okay? And in between nuclear envelope and nucleolus, you have the fluid, thick sticky fluid, that is called nucleoplasm. Nucleoplasm. Okay, so those are the 3 parts of a nucleus. Make sense? Okay, now let's go back, quickly review. So a typical cell, if I ask you, has how many parts? 3. The boundary is given by plasma membrane, right? And in the center, you have the control center, that is the nucleus. And in between, you have the cytoplasm, okay? In the cytoplasm, you have 2 types of organelles, membranous and non-membranous, okay? We'll talk about that later. Then, in the nucleus, you have 3 parts. envelope is the covering, right? And the dense part in the center of the nucleus, that is the nucleolus, okay? And in between, nucleoplasm, okay? In the nuclear envelope, you have tiny pores. Nuclear pores, okay? Openings. Okay, now we'll talk about the cytoplasm. It has membranous and non-membranous organelles. I'll just mention few important organelles. You have learned a cell in your high school as well as I believe in intro bio, right? So like all of you know about the cell. So we'll talk a little bit about important organelles only. So membranous organelles include mitochondria, so mitochondria produces plenty of ATP. That's why mitochondria are called the powerhouses. ATP gives what? Energy, right? Power. So mitochondria are called what? Powerhouses of the cell. Remember that. I will ask all these. Okay. So plenty of ATP comes from the mitochondria. Cellular metabolism mostly occurs inside the mitochondria, and metabolism produces ATP. Okay. Around the nucleus, you have packed tube-like structures. Those are called, they are like tubes. Many tubes are around the nucleus. And these are called endoplasmic reticulum or ER. Endoplasmic reticulum or what? ER. Shortcut, okay? Like this. So, endoplasmic reticulum. Now, on the surface of ER, sometime you will see tiny structures. Those are called ribosomes. So ribosomes are attached to the surface of the endoplasmic reticulum. Okay. So these ER are called rough surfaced ER or rough ER because the surface has a lot of tiny dots. Okay, makes sense? Ribosomes attached. So the surface is rough. So these are rough ER or rough surfaced ER. Same thing. Make sense?
It's mean the one they have these dots is a rough.
Rough,
The one
yes.
they don't have is
Right.
smooth.
Smooth ER. So some ER they don't have ribosomes attached. Okay.
Be free of those.
So like this one. This is smooth ER. Makes sense, right? So rough ER and smooth ER. Two types of endoplasmic reticulum. I'll just mention a couple of functions of each. Rough ER are responsible for folding and modifying, just write down this, modifying of proteins. Proteins. Okay? So protein, folding and modifying. Ribosomes, these tiny structures. Ribosomes are very important, although they are very small. Ribosomes manufacture proteins. So manufacturing proteins is the function, main function of the ribosomes. Okay. there is another structure, looks like, flattened sacs, flattened membranous sacs. Both ends are expanded like this, and middle part is narrow, and they are packed together, like stacked together, like this, okay, piled together. This is called Golgi apparatus. Golgi apparatus, okay. So flattened membranous sacs are piled together or stuck together. That is the Golgi apparatus. The function of Golgi apparatus is, I'll mention two functions. One is packaging. Packaging proteins, okay, and another function is vesicles formation of vesicles. Now let me go over again. So mitochondria produce plenty of ATP. That's why they are called powerhouses. Make sense? Okay, good. That means most of the cellular metabolisms occur inside the mitochondria. Now, around the nucleus, you have tube-like structures. They are connected to each other. These are called ER, endoplasmic reticulum. Make sense? Part of ER has ribosomes attached, and those are rough ER, okay? And part of ER don't have ribosomes attached. Those are called smooth ER, okay? And now, why, if I ask you, what's the function of ribosomes? Protein manufacturing. Make sense? Production of protein. And rough ER, folding and modifying protein, right? And Golgi apparatus, packaging protein. So you see, first, who is producing proteins? Ribosomes. Manufacturing, right? It's like a factory. Okay? Factory produces, right? The products. Ribosomes produce what? Proteins. Synthesis of protein. Okay? Then protein molecules go to rough ER. Okay? Go to another section. Inside the factory, manufacturing plant, you have factory, right? Then you have other sections too. So after production, the products go to another section. Make sense? Where folding, modifying, cutting, if it's too long, it will be, modified, change the size, done by rough ER. Make sense? Then the products are sent to the Golgi apparatus. And Golgi apparatus does what? Packaging. Right? So three things: manufacturing, modifying, and packaging are done by three different organs. Okay. Now, I said Golgi apparatus also produce vesicles. Vesicles are round membranous structures filled with proteins. So what happens, you see, both ends, expanded ends of Golgi apparatus, at one point they get detached from the main body, like this. Detached from the main body and get separated. These are called vesicles. Okay? Round membranous structures filled with proteins. So now these are the vesicles. Okay? Some vesicles are also called lysosomes. Lysosomes. Okay? Lysosomes. So anyway, the vesicles are round membranous structures. They move towards the cell membrane and get attached to the cell membrane and eventually rupture to release the chemicals to the outside of the cell. So they will get attached to the cell membrane and rupture to release the chemicals. And that is called exocytosis, how the vesicles release the chemicals to the outside of the cell. The process is called what? Exocytosis, how the vesicles release the chemicals to the outside of the cell. Some lysosomes or vesicles, they get attached to the antigens. For example, you got bacteria or virus inside the cell. These lysosomes or vesicles will get attached to them and release the chemicals, and they contain toxic chemicals that can destroy the antigens. Make sense? So some vesicles contain the digestive enzyme-like chemicals that can destroy the bacteria or microorganisms. Make sense? So it's like, defensive function by destroying the microorganisms. So that is the cell. Parts of a typical cell and their functions. There are more organelles. You have learned, I believe, in your high school. So let's stop here. Okay. So this is a typical cell. You can see those parts I have shown you. This is the cell membrane. This is the nucleus, nuclear envelope, nuclear pores, nucleolus, that dense structure, and nucleoplasm here in between. Rough ear, the blue structures, tiny red dots are ribosomes, and this is the smooth ear. I didn't mention the function of smooth ear. Smooth ear, this is important. Smooth ear has a couple of important functions. Detoxification. Toxic chemicals are neutralized inside the smooth ear. Okay. And another function, synthesis of lipids, lipid synthesis inside the cell. Okay. So write down these two functions of smooth ear. If I ask you, just mention these two. Mitochondria produce plenty of ATP, powerhouses. Golgi apparatus, you see both ends, flattened sacs, both ends are expanded, they get separated and form the vesicles. Okay, contain the chemicals, and exocytosis releases the chemicals to the outside. Okay. Okay. So plasma membrane or cell membrane. If you see the structure of a cell membrane under the microscope, powerful microscope like electron microscope, the structure of a cell membrane is called phospholipid. Phospholipid bilayer. That means bi means two, right? So two layers of phospholipid in which protein structures are embedded. Proteins. Structures are embedded. So phospholipid bilayer in which the proteins are inserted at different locations. Now if you see a cell membrane under the microscope, first let's see the phospholipid bilayer. These are phospholipids, okay? So I am drawing phospholipids. How many layers? Two. So this is one layer of phospholipid, this is another layer of phospholipid, okay? Bilayer. Okay, then inside the phospholipid bilayer you have proteins inserted or embedded. So this is a protein, big protein, then phospholipid, okay. Let me draw another protein. This one is partly inserted, not going all through. Okay. So these are proteins and phospholipid bilayer. Okay. So proteins, there are two types of proteins. You see, these proteins are inserted in phospholipid bilayer, right? These two are inserted. These are called integral proteins, deeply inserted in the phospholipid bilayer. They are called integral proteins. Okay, these two. And these proteins are attached to the integral proteins but not inserted in phospholipid bilayer. So these are called peripheral proteins. Peripheral proteins. Okay. So how many types of proteins? Two. Those are deeply inserted in phospholipid. Those are called integral, right? And those are attached to the integral but not inserted in phospholipid bilayer. Those are called peripheral proteins. Is it clear? Okay. Now, if you see a phospholipid unit or molecule, this is a phospholipid. It has a head part and tail part. Okay. Head part is also called polar end, and tail part is also called non-polar. Okay. So a phospholipid molecule has head and what? Tail. Head part is also called polar end and tail part is non-polar end. Now, this is interesting. Head part loves water or likes what? Water. Water liking part or loving part. And tail part dislikes water, okay? Make sense? So that's why head part is called hydro. Hydro means indicates water, right? You know that. Hydrophilic. Philia. Philia means what? Loving, liking, right? Philia, attraction. And that's why this part is called hydrophilic part. That means it loves or likes water. Hydrophilic head part, and tail part dislikes water. That's why it is called hydro. What do you think? Phobic. Phobia. Scared. Fear. So hydrophilic and hydrophobic part. Now you tell me, if I ask you, this part is what? Hydrophilic or hydrophobic? Hydrophilic, right? Head part. Only head parts are here, right? and this part, this entire part is what? Hydrophobic. Make sense? So that's why, since this entire part is hydrophobic, water cannot pass through this. Make sense? It will not let the water come or pass through. Make sense? It is like water. But water must enter into the cell. You know that, right? All cells need what? Water. So what happens through the protein structures? If you see inside some internal proteins, you have channels like this. So water passes through those channels through the integral proteins. Okay, so those integral proteins have channels, water, and water soluble chemicals can easily pass through the proteins, okay, but cannot pass through the phospholipid bilayer. Okay. So this is the main structure of a cell membrane or plasma membrane. Now, the structure of a cell membrane, there is a model to explain the structure of the cell membrane that is called fluid mosaic model. Why? Because if you see the cell membrane under electron microscope, very powerful from the top, if you see the surface of the cell membrane, you will see nice phospholipid layer, and in which the proteins are inserted. Make sense? So it's like a beautiful floor, you know, where you have white floor, phospholipid, okay, in which you have stones or marbles are inserted at different locations. Make sense? So it's like a mosaic. Now why is it fluid? Because this is interesting. These protein structures are changing their shapes. Now just think that you have a beautiful floor, okay, where you have, you know, stones or marbles, and they are moving, like changing their shapes, right? So looks like it's moving. The floor is moving, right? Waves. So that's why it is called fluid mosaic model of the structure of the cell membrane. Okay, constantly changing the protein structure. Okay, so two types of proteins, integral and peripheral. Now, these proteins are very important, both integral and peripheral. This is the integral. So, what are the important functions of the integral protein? One I have already mentioned. Some integral proteins have what? Channels. Remember? Vessels. So, transport by forming channels. Okay. Number one. Some integral proteins work as receptors. I will explain that to you soon. Act as receptors. Some integral proteins act as enzymes. Okay. So, the integral proteins have different functions. Transport, acting as enzymes, and acting as receptors. Okay. Transport, I have already explained you, right? Some integral proteins have channels, through channels. Like this is the integral protein. Okay, you have channel inside. So the water and water soluble chemicals, right? Because they cannot pass through the phospholipid bilayer, so they will easily pass through those channels. Is it clear? So that is one. Receptors. This is interesting function. This is phospholipid. Okay. This is the integral protein, phospholipid. Another integral protein. Phospholipid. Okay. And another integral protein here. Okay. So three integral integral proteins here can act as receptors. What is that? This is the outer surface of the cell membrane. Okay, this is inside. So this is outside of the cell. And these proteins, integral proteins, have binding sites at the outer end. For example, this integral protein has a binding site which is square shaped. This integral protein has a binding site which is round. This integral protein has a binding site which is what? Triangular. Make sense? Now, you have taken a medicine. Okay, that medicine, different medicines have different shapes of molecules. You know, that makes sense. Okay, for example, you have taken a medicine that has triangular shaped molecules. The medicine molecules or chemicals are triangular. Make sense? So when this medicine will go to the cell, what will happen? The medicine molecules will bind with the integral proteins, okay? Binding with the receptor sites. These are the receptor sites or binding sites. Binding sites on the receptors. Okay? Now, these molecules will fit to which one? Perfectly. Perfectly. Triangular, right? This integral protein has triangular shaped binding site. Make sense? So if these molecules go here, this one will say, no, you can't get attached to me. You cannot bind me. This one, no. No. This one will perfectly bind with the molecules. Make sense? So when that binding will be perfect, this integral protein will send a signal to inside the cell. This is the inside, this is outside. Inside the cell, you have cytoplasm, other things, okay? So when the binding will be, we say key lock type binding, perfect fitting, right? You all have keys, right? But you cannot open this door, okay? My key will open the door, make sense? Because it will perfectly fit into the lock, then it will open, right? So when that fit will be perfect, a signal like engine will start. You put your key in the car, right, and turn the engine on. So when that will happen, the cellular function will start inside the cell. That is the signal going to the cell, right, inside the cell. So cell machineries will start to work. Is it clear? Okay. So the binding must be perfect, like key lock type binding. Anyway, so if you take now example, many hormones are working on the cells of the body, right? Like insulin has the molecules like this. So these molecules will perfectly bind here. Make sense? Because round shaped binding site. Insulin will work on the tissue, on the cell. Yeah.
Let's send only the sign or open the protein kind.
Yeah. So after the binding occurs, these are not channeled proteins. No channel inside. Okay. Some proteins have channels. Not all. Those proteins have channels. They will help in transport of chemicals. Make sense? Those proteins, they don't have channels, but they have binding sites for the molecules, signal molecules. Yeah. So these are called all signal molecules, like medicines or hormones. These are signal molecules. Okay. Okay. So that's how some integral proteins act as receptors. So you see, this is the phospholipid bilayer, right? Phospholipid bilayer. These are what? What type of proteins? Integral proteins, right? Because inserted. And these are peripheral proteins. Make sense? So you see, this integral protein has channel inside, right? Not all. Some integral proteins have channels. Some integral proteins work as enzymes, help in chemical reactions. Okay? You see here, these two are channel proteins because they have channels. Make sense? So, there are two types of channel proteins. One is just, the small molecules, those are smaller than the size of the channel, will easily pass through the proteins. This is the protein. Those molecules are smaller than the size of the channel, they will easily get in or out. Make sense? Some integral proteins have channels, but those channels are controlled by what? ATP. That means to open the channels, you need energy. ATP. Make sense? So they will stay closed. When the molecules will pass, the ATP will work and will open the door. So some are always open,